President Trump and U.S. officials are hoping Vladimir Putin can be enticed into an agreement with the prospect of multi-billion-dollar deals for extracting oil and gas, mining minerals, and constructing hotels, office buildings, resorts, high-tech parks, and so much else. They believe similarly dazzling prospects would also soften up Ukraine to make compromises as well. The dream is that so much commerce will guarantee a durable peace between the two countries. Who knows what may emerge from these efforts, but no one should have any illusion about Putin. He'll only sign on to a deal that he feels will enable his rapid takeover of Ukraine. The prospect of a nice, Trump-constructed tower in Red Square.
Listen to what you just heard, because this is how democracies die in broad daylight, and we're going to unpack every vile layer of this authoritarian bargain, being pitched as deal-making genius when it's really just centuries of American moral leadership being auctioned off for a Trump tower in Moscow. I mean, did you catch that part about multi-billion-dollar deals for extracting oil and gas and mining minerals and constructing hotels and resorts? As if Putin is some kind of business partner waiting to be seduced by real estate portfolios, rather than the war criminal who has spent nearly 4 years systematically obliterating Ukrainian cities and murdering tens of thousands of innocent civilians in a genocidal campaign to erase an entire nation from existence. And here's where this gets absolutely chilling, because Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner and envoy Steve Witkoff have been meeting with Russian officials to hammer out these obscene commercial arrangements. While Putin has recently signaled he is digging in on his maximalist demands, Putin himself said that he is not eager to seek an end to the fighting in Ukraine, because a ceasefire would only give Ukraine a chance to consolidate its position. So let me be absolutely crystal clear about what's happening here, because this matters more than almost anything else in our geopolitical moment, and the stakes could not be higher. This isn't diplomacy, this is the wholesale moral corruption of American foreign policy, dressed up in the language of pragmatism, when what we're really witnessing is the most powerful democracy on earth, preparing to validate and reward territorial conquest through military aggression in exchange for business opportunities that will enrich Trump and his inner circle, while Ukrainian children continue to be pulled from rubble. And the month of June 2025 saw the highest civilian casualty count in Ukraine since the start of the invasion, with 232 killed and 1,343 injured. And the historical parallel here should make every progressive who studied 20th century authoritarianism absolutely sick to their stomach, because this is Munich all over again. Except instead of Chamberlain waving a piece of paper promising peace in our time, we have Trump dangling construction contracts and energy deals, as if capitalism can somehow neutralize imperialism, when we know from bitter historical experience that economic entanglement with fascist regimes only delays reckoning while emboldening aggression. Now buckle up, because this gets so much worse, and I need you to understand the full scope of what's being normalized here. At the center of Trump's contentious plan to end the Russia-Ukraine war isn't peace but profit, with Trump envoys negotiating with Russian officials to ensure U.S. businesses, and Trump's friends are in position to make a killing once the war ends. And when I say Trump's friends, I mean Kushner does not have an official U.S. government role, yet he's sitting at the negotiating table determining the fate of millions of Ukrainians and the future of the entire European security architecture. This is nepotistic foreign policy conducted by real estate developers and golf course owners who see geopolitics as just another deal to be closed rather than the life-and-death struggle between democracy and autocracy that it actually represents. And here's the part that should make your blood boil, because the U.S. plan echoed Russian demands that have remained largely unaltered since Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in early 2020, which means Trump isn't brokering peace, he's basically transcribing Putin's wish list into official American policy and calling it negotiation. The cynicism is absolutely breathtaking, and we need to name it for what it is, because the document foresaw large cash grabs for the U.S., amounting to little more than attempts at extortion, with typical Trumpian robber baron foreign policy. So let's pause and really absorb that characterization from foreign policy analysts who are watching in horror as American diplomacy degenerates into a protection racket, where we're essentially telling Ukraine, give Putin what he wants, or we'll cut you off, and oh, by the way, we're going to make sure American corporations get first dibs on your natural resources and reconstruction contracts. And the sheer predatory nature of this approach reveals everything you need to know about how Trump and his circle view international relations, not as a forum for advancing human rights and democratic values, but as a marketplace for extracting wealth and advancing personal business interests. And this is why the progressive critique of American empire has always been so vital, because underneath the rhetoric of freedom and democracy, there has always been a capitalist logic of exploitation, and now Trump has just stripped away all pretense and made that logic explicit and shameless. Here comes the bombshell that connects all of this to Putin's actual strategic objectives, because you need to understand what the Russian dictator actually wants, and spoiler alert, it has absolutely nothing to do with hotels or oil deals. Putin appears to be as committed as ever to his goal of extinguishing Ukrainian statehood entirely, and for many years Putin has publicly questioned the Ukrainian nation's right to exist. This isn't about security guarantees or NATO expansion, or any of the pretextual justifications that get laundered through sympathetic media outlets. This is about imperial restoration and the deliberate erasure of Ukrainian identity and sovereignty. Putin wants all the areas in 4 key regions captured by his forces, as well as Crimea, to be recognized as Russian territory, and he has demanded that Ukraine withdraw from some areas in eastern Ukraine that Moscow's forces have not captured yet. Putin is demanding territory he doesn't even control militarily, which tells you everything about his negotiating posture and his ultimate aims, and Putin's demands are based on an aborted 2022 peace deal negotiated in Istanbul and must take into account the facts on the ground, meaning every day Russia continues its grinding offensive, it improves its bargaining position, which creates a perverse incentive structure where Putin benefits from prolonging the bloodshed. And now the crushing geopolitical reality that every progressive foreign policy analyst has been screaming about, because Putin reiterated his maximalist demands, including that Ukraine must cede additional territories to Russia, abandon all hope of joining NATO, demilitarize and denazify, demands which are unacceptable to Kiev, and suggest that Putin is confident that the war is trending in his favor. So when Trump and his business associates talk about enticing Putin with commercial opportunities, they're operating under a catastrophically naive misunderstanding of Russian strategy, or they're deliberately pretending to misunderstand in order to provide political cover for capitulation, because Putin's ambitions extend far beyond seizing a few Ukrainian provinces, and for decades he has fought to keep Ukraine within Russia's sphere of influence and rewrite the broader security order in Europe. This is about overturning the post-Cold War settlement and establishing a new world order based on spheres of influence where great powers get to dominate their neighbors without interference. And if we allow that to happen, if we validate that logic through this sham peace process, then we have functionally ended the rules-based international order that has prevented major power war for 8 decades and opened the door to Chinese aggression against Taiwan and territorial revisionism everywhere. Let me hit you with the most disturbing revelation yet, and this is where we need to talk about corruption and self-dealing at the highest levels, because Russia believes it could become an economic powerhouse in Europe while driving a wedge between the United States and its traditional European allies by coordinating with the US on profitable business ventures. You understand the implications here, because Putin sees Trump's greed and transactionalism as a strategic weapon that can be exploited to fracture the Western alliance. Europe balked at Trump's 28-point peace plan, which Witkoff drafted based on a Russian plan, arguing it was overly generous to Russia, as the deal had Ukraine concede territory and cut its military capacity, effectively neutering the nation's sovereignty. So our European allies looked at Trump's proposal and immediately recognized it as a Russian diktat masquerading as American mediation. And this is the isolation that comes from abandoning multilateral consensus building in favor of strongman deal-making, because Trump has managed to do what Putin couldn't accomplish through military force alone, which is divide the West and make the United States an unreliable partner, and the damage this does to American credibility and soft power will take generations to repair, assuming it can be repaired at all. Here's where the class analysis becomes absolutely essential, and we cannot let this dimension get obscured, because Russia gets maybe 70% of what it wants. Ukraine gets other things which, considering the situation on the battlefield, could be worse. But the real winner is the US as arbiter, meaning the real winners are Trump and his associates, who get to position themselves as indispensable brokers while lining up business deals. There is talk about critical minerals, both Ukrainian and Russian critical minerals, so it seems like Americans basically get to operate in Ukraine or participate in Ukraine's reconstruction being financed by European and Russian money. This is shock doctrine capitalism applied to geopolitics, where a humanitarian catastrophe becomes an investment opportunity and reconstruction becomes a vehicle for resource extraction, and Ukrainian sovereignty is reduced to a legal fiction, while American oligarchs in partnership with Russian oligarchs carve up the country's wealth. And if that doesn't clarify the fundamentally extractive nature of American capitalist imperialism, then I don't know what will, because we're watching it happen in real time with barely any attempt to disguise the predatory logic. Now we need to examine the specific mechanisms of betrayal, because Trump has pressed Zelensky to reach a deal by Thanksgiving, and a U.S. official said that Russian President Putin seems to believe that he will take the Donetsk region one way or the other, through a negotiated settlement or on the battlefield, with the Trump administration's negotiations beginning from the premise that Putin is correct. So American negotiators have accepted Russian territorial gains as a fait accompli before talks even begin, which means Ukraine is being pressured to formalize its own dismemberment under threat of abandonment. And when pressed on concerns that Witkoff was too sympathetic to Russia's maximalist war goals, Trump replied that Witkoff has to sell this to Ukraine, and sell Ukraine to Russia, because that's what a dealmaker does. And that response should chill you to your core, because Trump is openly admitting that his envoy is functioning as a salesman for Russian demands, rather than a defender of Ukrainian sovereignty or American values. This is transactional amorality elevated to foreign policy doctrine, where principles are obstacles to be overcome, and moral considerations are just friction in the deal-making process. The institutional degradation deserves our full attention, because future U.S.-Russian business deals should not be on the agenda for peace talks, and most of the participants in the last round of talks in Moscow were business people, so we've replaced career diplomats and regional experts with real estate developers and private equity guys who see every interaction through the lens of profit maximization. Experts note it's quite extraordinary to have someone with no official position as a member of the negotiating team, with concerns that someone would need deep knowledge of issues ahead of attending meetings, rather than learning on the job. This is what happens when you hollow out the State Department and replace professional expertise with personal loyalty and business acumen. You get catastrophically bad policy shaped by people who fundamentally don't understand the region or the history or the stakes, and who are primarily motivated by commercial opportunity rather than national security, and the long-term consequence is the systematic demolition of American diplomatic capacity at precisely the moment when the world needs sophisticated multilateral problem-solving the most. Let me bring this to the moral and historical reckoning we desperately need, because U.S. policies have been in place to isolate Russia over its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but the Trump administration is now poised to make a deal with the Kremlin to end the war without Ukraine having much of a say. And this departure from traditional U.S. foreign policy is radical, given that Russia is a daily threat to the rest of Europe, and historian Anne Applebaum, who literally won the Pulitzer Prize for her work on autocracy, warns that Trump's maneuvering is raising concerns not just in Europe, but in the capitals of allies around the world, as U.S. foreign policy has for about 80 years been based on a network of alliances and institutions that allowed America to project power and create zones of prosperity. And what we're witnessing is nothing less than the dramatic departure from traditional U.S. foreign policy toward Russia, spanning the Cold War and the rise of Putin, an extraordinary pivot upending decades of hawkish foreign policy and raising questions about the future of the post-World War II global security project. So this isn't just another policy disagreement between left and right. This is a wholesale abandonment of the architecture that prevented World War III and the return to great power competition, based on spheres of influence and military might, makes right, and progressives have been warning about American militarism and imperialism for decades, but the answer to those critiques was never to embrace Russian imperialism. Instead, the answer was, and remains, a commitment to genuine international law and collective security and human rights that applies to all nations equally. And here's the gut punch that should motivate every single person watching to action, because in just over a month, Trump has executed a startling realignment of American foreign policy, effectively throwing U.S. support behind Moscow and rejecting the tight alliance with Kyiv, an extraordinary pivot that has upended decades of hawkish foreign policy toward Russia that provided a rare area of bipartisan consensus. And while progressives have long critiqued Cold War anti-communism and interventionism, there is a massive difference between opposing American imperialism and enabling Russian fascism, between advocating for diplomatic solutions and betraying an ally facing genocidal aggression, and what Trump is doing has nothing to do with peace or pragmatism, and everything to do with either an inducement to Moscow in ongoing peace talks, or a preemptive surrender by a president sadly familiar with waving the white flag before America's adversaries, an idea that experts say is ill-considered, poorly timed, doomed to fail, and counterproductive to for even establishment foreign policy voices who don't share progressive politics on most issues can recognize this for the disaster it is. I need you to feel the urgency of this moment viscerally in your bones, because nearly 4 years since Russia's full-scale invasion, Russia still occupies roughly 20% of Ukraine after gaining over 4,000 square kilometers of territory in 2024, and Russia continues to bombard Ukrainian cities while Ukraine maintains drone attacks on Russian oil infrastructure and military sites. People are dying right now, while Trump's envoys discuss mineral rights and hotel construction. Russia seized Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula in 2014 and fomented war in Donbass, which was still simmering when Putin ordered the full-scale invasion, leading to the biggest war in Europe since 1945, with some 1.5 million soldiers on both sides killed or wounded, and thousands of Ukrainian civilians killed or injured in daily Russian drone and missile attacks. This is the human cost of the aggression that Trump wants to reward with sanctions relief and business deals, and every progressive who claims to care about imperialism and militarism and human rights needs to be absolutely unequivocal in opposing this betrayal, because there is no anti-imperialist case for allowing Putin to conquer Ukraine any more than there would have been an anti-imperialist case for allowing Hitler to conquer Czechoslovakia. The theoretical framework we need here is a clear-eyed understanding of how capitalism and imperialism intersect, because what we're seeing is the reduction of geopolitics to commercial opportunity and the transformation of national security into business development. The document seems more focused on bringing about a new era of friendly Russia-US economic cooperation than a serious attempt to resolve Europe's biggest land war since World War II, with typical Trumpian robber baron foreign policy foreseeing large cash grabs for the US. And this is late-stage neoliberalism in its purest, most grotesque form, where literally everything, including the sovereignty of nations and the lives of civilians, becomes commodified and subject to deal-making, where the only values that matter are profit, and the only relationships that count are transactional. And if we don't fundamentally challenge this logic, if we don't build a foreign policy rooted in solidarity and human dignity and collective security rather than extraction and domination, then we're just going to see this pattern repeat endlessly with different actors and different victims. The path forward requires moral clarity and political courage, because we need to be absolutely clear that opposing Trump's Russia policy doesn't mean supporting endless war or American militarism. It means supporting Ukraine's right to exist as a sovereign nation, and opposing the normalization of territorial conquest and standing with democracy against fascism. And we can do that while also pushing for a just peace that addresses legitimate security concerns, and while critiquing American foreign policy overreach in other contexts. The progressive position has to be that international law applies to everyone, including and especially great powers, that borders cannot be changed by force, that civilians cannot be targeted, that war crimes must be prosecuted. These are not negotiable principles, and they're not Western impositions. They're universal values that emerge from the ashes of the 20th century's catastrophic wars, and if we abandon them in Ukraine, we've abandoned them everywhere, and we've opened the door to a much darker and more violent world order, and that's what's at stake in this moment. That's why every person of conscience needs to be speaking out and organizing and demanding that our government stand with Ukraine rather than selling it out for Trump Tower Moscow, because this is how democracies die. This is how international order collapses. This is how we sleepwalk into catastrophe while telling ourselves we're just being realistic when what we're really being is complicit.